Beloved, writes the Apostle John, do not believe every spirit, but try the spirits to see whether they are from God. Hello, I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley. Welcome to Bethel Evangelical Free Church, Hanley on YouTube. In this video I want to talk about what is perhaps one of the great concerns of our age, perhaps one of the bugbears of our age, if I may put it that way: fake news. It's language that I think most people really became aware of around about the 2016 US elections, with people on both sides getting hot under the collar about fake news, although with radically different definitions. On the one hand, there were those for whom fake news meant that which appears in the form of news but is not news. Made up stories that appeared on websites with names like Right Wing News Now or The Rightists. In other cases, it was news reporting that was felt to be biased in a left-wing direction. But there's a fair amount of overlap. What is fake news? Well, the definition I want to use is that which is in the form of news, which presents itself as news, but is not in fact news. This covers a fair number of things, because sometimes newspapers can report something, or news sites, I'm dating myself saying newspapers really, but news websites can report things that they believe, and newspapers can report things they believe to be true, which are in fact false. There are such things, after all, as hoaxes and frauds that are perpetrated upon the public. Perhaps one of the best known ones in the 20th century is this, the Hitler Diaries. This is Robert Harris's excellent book, Selling Hitler. It deals with the apparent discovery. It was front page news in the Sunday Times of all places. It originally began with a German magazine, Stern, one of whose reporters believed that he had gained access to the personal diaries of none other than Adolf Hitler. Gerd Heidemann, try not to get his name mixed up. Gerd Heidemann was, and as far as I'm aware still is, very interested in the Third Reich, that period of German history, and built up quite a collection of materials regarding Hitler and his associates. And so when someone in that circle offered these diaries, he believed them. As it turned out, the whole thing was a fraud, a forgery, and yet it was believed all the way up to the Sunday Times. It fell apart very quickly afterwards, but it was believed, and there's a sense in which we can say the Hitler Diaries were fake news, not because the newspapers were deceiving people, but because the newspapers were themselves deceived. To take another example, an example from this century. In 2007, I was having breakfast with my friend Martin Smith, deacon of the Tabernacle Baptist Church in Wellingborough, Northamptonshire. I'd been preaching there on the Sunday and I was about to go back home on the Monday. And on the news, on the radio, came the announcement that the family tomb of Jesus had been discovered. And this had been confirmed somehow by DNA. And we looked at each other, and Martin said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, I don't know the details, but it sounds awfully fishy to me. I have a BSc in environmental science. I've done a little bit of study of genetics and this sort of thing, so I'm slightly more educated on these things than most people. I would certainly not say I was an expert. I mean, A-level biology and BSc, Liverpool BSc from, as you earned at Chester. But it means I know a little bit more about these things, and the question, well, how do you work this out. And of course, what happened within days was the whole thing fell apart. But again, the family tomb of Jesus, that was presented as news. The newspapers, news channels reported it. But it turned out to be false. This is James White's From Toronto to Emmaus, which is a thorough debunking of these claims of the so-called Jesus family tomb. There are other cases. For example, perhaps the best known of the lot would be the Da Vinci Code. This book is a bestseller, of course. I remember when I was at seminary, which is 15 years ago now. Everyone was reading it on the underground, it seemed. The film came out and it sold out at certain London cinemas. At many London cinemas, many cinemas around Britain, it sold out. And this film, although it's a work of fiction, the book is a work of fiction, it claims to be based on fact. So, he opens, fact. The Priory of Sion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organisation. In 1975, Paris's Bibliothèque Nationale discovered parchments known as Les Dossiers Secrets, identifying numerous members of the Priory of Sion, including Sir Isaac Newton, Sandro Botticelli, Victor Hugo, and Leonardo da Vinci. Now, of course, this is, in many ways, the sort of technique that novelists will use to draw readers in. Oh yes, the story may be fiction, but behind it is fact. The reality is it's rubbish. The Les Dossiers Secrets were smuggled into the Bibliothèque Nationale because at the time, in the 1970s, the security guards checked people's bags as they left the building, but not as they went in. We don't know why they were secreted there, but we know that they do not appear in any registers before the 1970s. Again, fakes, forgeries. Well, this is one particular type of fake news. It's the forgery. It's the misunderstanding. It's something that is brought to the press, and the press are told this is true, and it's not. It's brought to the public, and the public are told this is a fact, and it's not. One sort of fake news. There's been all kinds. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife, for example, a few years ago, this little scrap, like a business card, appeared, and it was lauded, this is a lost gospel in which Jesus says, my wife. The trouble is that all the evidence, all the examination has proven it may be genuine, old, not ancient, but medieval papyrus, maybe written on with genuine old-fashioned ink, but anyone can find a piece of old papyrus, and anyone can make a type of ink that doesn't involve modern pigments and such like. But the actual text appears to have been cribbed from something on the internet. Fake news. But the other type of fake news is something that appears in the form of news, but is not news. Now, I've been reading recently this rather interesting volume, Bad News, Why We Fall for Fake News by Rob Brotherton. It's a marvellous book. He opens with an example that's perhaps very familiar to a lot of people. Certainly it's something I read about when I was a boy. The Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast. You've heard the story. Orson Welles adapted H.G. Wells, no relation, novel The War of the Worlds, and the opening, instead of being a straightforward narration, was in the form of a series of news reports about the landing of the aliens in New Jersey. Mass panic ensued. People thought they were listening to the real news reports. People fled. Some people had heart attacks. Some people killed themselves. Mass panic. Millions affected. Except it didn't happen. The fake news was actually the reporting at the time by certain newspapers, all of whom, of course, tended along the lines of, well, the only people who were fooled by it were idiots. No one was fooled in our city, therefore people in our city are brilliant. There was no mass panic. Scanning all the news reports, there are a few cases where people did panic. There were people who didn't realise that they'd accidentally tuned into a radio play and phoned the police to find out what was going on. But the vast majority of people knew it was a radio play. I mean, it was a scheduled radio play. They could pick up their newspapers, see what the schedules were. But the newspapers afterwards report this mass panic that never happened. Well, that's fake news, surely. Because it appears in the form of news. It's something that goes down in history as this mass panic. But there's no evidence for it at the time. There's no evidence in terms of police reports. There's no evidence in terms of first-hand accounts. It was itself fake news. And so this then leads to the question, why do people believe nonsense dressed up as news? Why is it? And we come back to the Bible quote I began with. Test the spirits. And the language there, this is to do with people who came to the church and they claimed to be prophets with messages from God. And the Apostle John says, don't believe everyone who says, I've got a message from God, but test them and try them. That's what we do with fake news, with what appears to be news reports. The most obvious test, and the one I've seen most often ignored, is where does it come from? So if something's in the Sunday Times or the Daily Times newspaper, then I can be pretty certain that whoever published it believed it to be news. This is intended to be taken as news. The Hitler Diaries, when this was published, this fake was published because the newspaper believed it was real. They'd been had. On the other hand, if something appears on World News Daily Report, a satirical entertainment website, or on the Babylon Bee, which is a Christian satirical website, then I know that this story is not in fact true, but is intended as satire or entertainment. It's not supposed to be taken seriously. Sometimes, of course, it's difficult to tell whether a website is real news or not. Some years ago there was a case of a report that Pope Francis had declared all religions are true. And this report circulated quite widely. People believed it. It appeared on certain news sites, for example, out of Africa and India. It came from a website called Diversity Chronicle. Now, if you did some digging around on Diversity Chronicle, you could find out pretty quickly that it has a disclaimer saying everything on this website is made up. But people just didn't do that. They didn't do these basic checks. Well, what's this website? I've never heard of this website before. Where does it come from? When was it founded? What's on it? If a website appeared 5 minutes ago, then reason to be suspicious. If a website is plastered with disclaimers saying everything on this website is satire, then for crying out loud, everything on the website's satire. Some people appear not to read beyond headlines. They see a headline linked somewhere, oh, outrage, and don't even bother to look at what the story actually says. A headline is not a summary of a story that says, well, you don't have to read the story now. A headline is an invitation to read, and headlines are not written, on the whole, by the people who write the articles. Some newspapers and news websites have the most clickbaity headlines ever. Clickbait, of course, is something that, oh, you must click on this, or engagement bait. And very often what people actually do is they don't click on it at all, but they circulate it, so they get all these links to what is generally complete and total rubbish. And I've seen so much over the years. Christians must not be gullible. The first and primary reason people believe stuff that's not true is confirmation bias. Again, back to the Hitler Diaries. Why did Gerd Heidemann believe that they were real? Because they confirmed his own suspicions, his own desires. They were something he wanted them to be real. And so he was deceived by the forger because the forger made him want it to be real. And then, of course, they were sold on to Well, Stern magazine, first of all, was paying huge amounts of money for them. And so, of course, if you're paying huge amounts of money for something, you want it to be real. They didn't want these things they paid huge amounts of money for to be debunked. Confirmation bias. This agrees with what I want, therefore it's true. But the reality is that stories may confirm all your biases and still be complete and total nonsense. There was some years ago a report, again from one of these sites, that had a Roman historian giving an account of a miracle performed by Jesus. And I saw certain Christians fall for it immediately. I said, hang on a minute. What's the source? Where does it come from? This is something that is too... yeah, it's rather convenient. Check, check and recheck. Because there's fake news all around us. And it doesn't always advertise itself. Now, usually, I have to say it does. The other thing is that real news stories can be misinterpreted, misunderstood. Test, try, examine. And the same is true, simply because a claim comes from a Christian. Simply because something comes from a Christian minister, comes from a Christian ministry that you trust, doesn't mean it's true. Christians can be misled and make mistakes as well. Test all things, says the apostle. He's speaking particularly in terms of claims of divine revelation. He says, test all things. Hold fast that which is good. Reject evil wherever it appears. Test, try, examine. Truth has nothing to fear from examination. And don't make a fool of yourself. Check, examine. The gospel is not fake news. The gospel has been examined, is being examined. And I'm not afraid of people examining the scriptures, looking into the scriptures, because I'm sure it's real. The man who doesn't want people looking too closely at his document leaves you with the question, well, is it real? But God is a God of truth, and God's people should be concerned for truth, not for what's convenient for me, not for what I like, but what is true. Whatever is true, we think upon what is true, what is good, what is right, because God is true. And let God be true, and every man a liar. Well, thank you for watching these slightly disjointed ramblings on the subject of fake news. I think it's an important subject, and the most important thing we have to do, as I say, is examine, examine, examine. Just because something appears to be a news story doesn't mean it is. The easiest stuff to debunk is the stuff that's not really a news story at all. What's harder is when news organisations and people we trust to report the news themselves are mistaken. And again, if somebody is mistaken, if somebody does fall for a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding, or even a falsehood, we don't treat them as liars, frauds and hoaxers. But we remember that we all have been misled. I'm not saying, oh, I never get misled by fake news. Now, the reason why I put so much effort into these things, I've been deceived in the past. I think about these things because I don't want to be fooled again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, as the old proverb has it. Well, again, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you, and help you to look carefully at the world around us.